Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Tapas Ray. I teach at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. Here we will talk about the module on phrase structure grammar 2, which is part of the course on advanced syntax. In this module, we will talk about the constituents of the verb phrase, and also we'll talk about the constituents of preposition phrases, adjective phrases, and adverb phrases. In a previous module, we looked at the constituents of a sentence. As you know, a simple sentence will generally have a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and in that module we also looked at a few constituents of the verb phrase like auxiliary verbs and the main verb. We saw how there can be different types of auxiliary verbs. In this module we will take a look at the other constituents of the verb phrase, and we will also talk about some other phrases. Now, to begin with, let us talk about tense. As you know, in every verb phrase of a finite clause, tense is there. It is either, in English, it will be either present tense or past tense. In the English tense system, we have two types of tense, which is either present or past. For example, take a verb like go. The present tense form is go and the past tense form is went. Similarly, we have other verbs, for example, write, wrote, or bring, brought, or work, worked, etc. Although we have two tense forms in the English language, we know that generally every language can talk about three phases of time: past, present, and the future. Look at the screen. You find that we have some examples there, 1 ABC and 2 ABC. In 1A we have she wrote a letter yesterday, which is past tense, and also it talks about past time. She is writing a letter now, 1B, it is present time and it also is present tense. She will write a letter tomorrow. The tense is present, but it refers to future time. Similarly, you find in 2ABC, the first sentence 2A, this is past tense and it refers to past time. In 2B, we have present tense, the verb is in present tense and it also refers to present time. However, in 2C, the tense is present but it refers to future time. So what we notice is that there is no one-to-one correspondence between tense and time. Although there is some correspondence between tense and time, this is not the case all the time. Like we find in 2C or 1C, even present tense can refer to the future time. Look at the screen now. You have 4 examples there, 5, 6, 7 and 8. In 5 we have today we are working from 9 AM to 5 PM. In 6 we have we are working from 9 AM to 1 PM. In 7 we have they have been living in Chennai for 5 years, and in 8 they had been living in Chennai for 5 years. So what we notice in these sentences is that tense is always marked on the verb if there is no auxiliary verb, and it is marked on the first auxiliary verb if there are more than one auxiliary verbs. So what we can say is the VP of each finite clause has an auxiliary node, and the first node that an auxiliary node dominates is the tense node. And tense, like the perfective or the passive suffix en, it gets attached to the verb, whether it's auxiliary or the main verb that immediately follows it. So we can have a diagram like this where you have the VP, and under the VP we have the auxiliary and the V. Under auxiliary, the first node that we have is tense, and then modal, then perfective, then progressive and passive, and then the main verb. In the auxiliary, the first node is tense, then we may have a modal, then perfective, then progressive, and then passive, and then we will have the main verb. So this tense is marked on the modal if there is a modal. If there is no modal, it will be marked on the perfective if there is a perfective. But if there is neither modal or perfective but there is progressive, then it will be marked on the progressive. But if none of them is there but passive is there, then it will be marked on the passive. But if none of these auxiliary verbs are there, tense in that case will be marked on the main verb. Let us look at a few sentences and see how tense is marked. For example, in 3 we have we work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. In 4 we have yesterday we worked from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. 5 today we are working from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. In 6 we have yesterday we are working from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And in 7 we have they have been living in Chennai for 5 years, and in 8 we have they had been living in Chennai for 5 years. Now look at 3a. Now notice that the tense is here marked on the main verb because there is no other auxiliary verb. Next. And in 4a also, where we have the verb worked, the tense is again marked on the main verb because there is no other auxiliary verb. So look at sentence 6. Here we have yesterday we are working from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Here we have progressive as an auxiliary verb, and therefore the past tense is marked on the progressive verb be, and we get where. In 7 we have the sentence they have been living in Chennai for 5 years, and in this we have the perfective as the first auxiliary. There is also another auxiliary, the progressive be. However, since perfective is the first auxiliary, the tense is marked on the perfective, and therefore we get have. Similarly, in 8 what we find is that we have both perfective and progressive auxiliaries in the verb phrase, and tense is past, and therefore the tense is marked on the first perfective auxiliary, and we get had. Look at the screen. We have this example 12. The building was being built at that time. In this sentence, as you can see in the diagram, we have two auxiliary verbs, progressive and passive. However, tense is marked on the progressive be because it is the first auxiliary, and not on the passive because it is the second auxiliary. Now let us think about the constituents of the verb phrase. So far we have looked at only the auxiliary verbs. Now we'll consider the other constituents of a verb phrase. First of all, let us consider this example, he snowed. In this we have only tense, there is no auxiliary verb, and therefore the tense is marked on the main verb. However, in the second sentence we have quite a few auxiliaries. The house might have been being built. In this we have tense which is marked on the modal because that is the first auxiliary. We have other auxiliaries, perfective, progressive, passive. However, tense is marked on the modal because that is the first auxiliary. Now let us look at some other verb phrases. She met the teacher. Here we have a noun phrase after the verb. And now we have sentence 4, which is a sentence where there is a ditransitive verb like give. So we have two objects after the verb, and therefore we say in the diagram we indicate that there are two NPs after the verb. In 5 we have the sentence they made him the chairman, and here we have again two NPs after the verb. In 6 we have a complex transitive verb where we have a noun phrase after the verb and which is followed by an adjective phrase. And in 7 again a complex transitive verb where we have the object noun phrase after the verb which is followed by the preposition phrase on the table. So these are the constituents of the verb phrase. Now let us look at some more sentences. Here in 8 we have the sentence she became impatient. Here we have an adjective phrase after the verb. In 9 we have a be verb as the main verb. Here be verb is not an auxiliary verb and we have the noun phrase after the be verb. And in 10 we have a preposition phrase after the be verb which is again a main verb, and tense is marked on the main verb. Now look at the rules that we have formulated for these sentences. In the first sentence, that is sentence 1, we had only auxiliary and a verb, and therefore the rule is 11A, where VP goes into auxiliary and V. In the second one also we had the tense and then the verb, and therefore we have 11B as the rule, where VP again goes to aux and V. However, in 11C we have VP which goes to aux, V and a noun phrase. In D the VP goes into aux, V, then two noun phrases. In 11E, which is for sentence 5, we have again two noun phrases which follow the verb, the main verb. In 11F, however, which is the rule for sentence 6, the main verb is followed by a noun phrase and an adjective phrase. For sentence 7, we have the rule 11G, where the V is followed by a noun phrase and a preposition phrase. Then in 11H, the main verb is followed by an adjective phrase, which is the rule for sentence 8. And in 11I, we have the V going into aux, V and noun phrase, where the noun phrase is after the V. And in 11J, which is the rule for the verb phrase in sentence 10, V is followed by a PP. So we can have a rule now for all the verb phrases in these 10 sentences. What we found is that every verb phrase had an auxiliary, and every verb phrase also had a main verb, and these are therefore obligatory constituents of the verb phrases in sentences 1 to 10, and therefore aux and V, as you can notice, are not in round brackets. However, the NP that we have after the verb, or the two NPs that we had in some sentences after the main verb, or the noun phrase and adjective phrase, or noun phrase and preposition phrase, or only adjective phrase or only preposition phrase that we had after the main verb in some sentences, they are not there in all the sentences. Therefore, we say that they are optional, and to indicate that we are using round brackets. However, we know that we can have only one of these things. We can either have an NP after the verb, or we can have two NPs, or we can have an NP and an adjective phrase, or we can have an NP and a preposition phrase, or we can have only an adjective phrase, or we can have a preposition phrase, only a preposition phrase after the verb. So we can have one of them, and therefore, since they are alternatives, we put them in curly brackets. You know from module 1 that when we have alternatives, we use curly brackets. However, even if they are alternatives, they are also optional. It's not necessary that we must have one of them after the main verb. As you saw in some sentences, there was no NP or adjective phrase or preposition phrase after the main verb. We had only auxiliary and the main verb, and therefore we say that all of them are optional, and therefore they are put in round brackets. Now let us have a rule for the auxiliary, and this rule is in 14b. You can see that here auxiliary goes into tense, modal, perfective, progressive and passive. This is because we have tense in all the auxiliaries, in all the sentences tense is there. However, other things like modal, perfective, progressive and passive, they are not there in all the sentences. Since they are not there in all the sentences, we consider them to be optional, and therefore they are given in round brackets. However, tense is not in round brackets because it is considered to be an obligatory constituent of the auxiliary. It is because it is considered to be an obligatory constituent of the 10 sentences we saw, and therefore it is not given in round brackets. So as we saw, we can have different kinds of constituents in different verb phrases. All main verbs are preceded by an auxiliary which may have only tense or other things like modal, progressive, passive, perfective, etc. And the main verb may be followed by some other phrases like a noun phrase or a preposition phrase or an adjective phrase, or there can be even two noun phrases or one noun phrase and another preposition phrase. And we saw how we can make rules depending on what kinds of constituents we have in a verb phrase. Now let us consider adverb phrases. We have this sentence, it rained suddenly, where suddenly is an adverb phrase, and we have this diagram for the adverb phrase where the adverb phrase consists of only the adverb which is suddenly. Now look at sentence 2, where we have this sentence, Surekha spoke rather rudely. Here rather rudely is the adverb phrase, and here rather is a degree word, and therefore the tree for the adverb phrase has two elements. One is the degree word and the other is the adverb. Now we have a rule for this adverb phrase in 4. Here adverb phrase has two things. One is the degree word, the other is the adverb. The degree word is an optional thing in the adverb phrase in these two adverb phrases, and therefore it is given in round brackets. In this module we saw that within the verb phrase there can be some other phrases after the verb, like there can be a noun phrase, there can be a preposition phrase, there can be an adjective phrase, and there can also be sometimes two noun phrases after the verb, or there can be a noun phrase and a preposition phrase after the verb, or there can be a noun phrase and adjective phrase after the verb, or there can also be just an adverb phrase after the verb. And we try to formulate rules for them. We saw that if we are considering a few sentences where in the verb phrases some of these phrases are alternatives, then we use curly brackets. If some of the phrases are optional, we use round brackets. In addition to that, we also saw how tense is realized in English. We saw that although we have two tense forms like present tense and past tense, we have three phases of time, and therefore we do not have one-to-one correspondence between tense and time all the time. Sometimes even if the tense is present, the time reference can be to the future. So we also looked at other phrases like preposition phrases and adjective phrases and adverb phrases. We saw that they can have some optional constituents like maybe a degree word sometimes or a noun phrase sometimes, and if there is an optional element, then we put in round brackets. So this module tells us how to analyze different kinds of phrases like a verb phrase, an adjective phrase, a preposition phrase, and an adverb phrase, and how to write a rule for that. If you want any further information about this, you can please visit EPG Pathshala website. Thank you.